So, hello and welcome to our next session with Rhonda Magee, author of The Inner Work of Racial Justice. I have been waiting anxiously for anticipating this particular talk. I had the privilege of um, interviewing her for the Organizational Mindfulness podcast, and it was an incredible conversation. And I'm sure this will be as well. So, looking forward to that. Before we begin, let's take a moment and just get present with your experience of now. What's happening with you now? Take a breath and relax. We do these transitional moments just to give our neurology time to adapt to a shift from whatever's been going on in your life, whatever messaging, or maybe you were at the tables in the lounge or just joining us now, and taking a moment to remind your nervous system. And we're going to press pause on the regular routine of life for a while, just to be present with this experience, which you've chosen to do out of all the things you can do in your life. And we respect that by breathing into our experience and relaxing for just a moment. Leaning into relaxing in presence. Thank you so much for taking this time to be with us. And I'd like to invite Mark and Rhonda to the stage.
Thanks again, Brett, for bringing us back into the present moment. Hello, Rhonda. Welcome.
Hello, Mark. It's wonderful to be here with you. And thank you, Brett, as well. I'm appreciating it.
Okay, so in this session, we're very happy to be joined by Rhonda Magee, who's the author of an award-winning book titled The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness. And she also has an Audible version, which we'll post into the chat for everybody to check out. She read it herself. I imagine that, was quite a feat. So, and it's much more personable for everybody to experience that content. So I invite everybody to check it out. She's also a mindfulness teacher, MBSR group facilitator, and law professor at the University of San Francisco. Rhonda, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to head off stage and looking forward to this.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again, my dear Mark and Brett, and and most especially everyone who has taken this time to join with us in conscious conversation and reflection uh, on the particular theme of the inner work of inclusion as we consider the future as a mindful future. The inner work of inclusion. Again, my book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, invites us to really look at the inner dimensions of, in particular, the racial justice piece, but it does invite a reconsideration of how it is that there's an inner dimension to all of the work that we are engaged in as we seek to make the world a bit better place for all of us in which to thrive and to flourish. that inner dimension and the link between the commitments we make to healing ourselves, the subtitle of my book, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities through mindfulness. Um, Again, the inner work in my title is sort of pointing toward mindfulness as an important component of that in the teachings that I offer. But at the same time, it's an invitation for us to think about what are the components of the kinds of inner work that may support us in being who we need to be to help bring about a more just world, starting right where we are. So, in the time that we have today, I'm gonna, share a few reflections on what I've been up to in the 2.5 years since this book came out. I've been doing a tremendous amount of presenting and listening, offering supportive practices, and offering the space for reflection on how these practices are helping create a ground of resourcedness within ourselves as a support for turning toward those who are with us on the journey, whether in our particular office communities, our particular departments, our broader institutional settings. In other words, that inner work is embedded in a world such that what we do to support and cultivate capacity within ourselves is something then we can, even sometimes without naming it, right? We can offer the resources of that beingness in our interactions with others, creating a little bit more space for the predictable conflicts, differences, dissonances that arise when we come together. When any two people come together, frankly, in my own experience, we've got some dissonances within ourselves that are part of what we're trying to hold space for in doing these practices. So as we cultivate the capacity to heal ourselves, to create more space for working through our own conflicts, for accessing our power, because we all have power, no matter what differentiations we experience in terms of external power, we all have degrees of internal power. And so fundamentally, I see the inner work of inclusion. The first, maybe the first agenda item on that is like, how is it that we do the work to strengthen ourselves so that we are more able to access the power we have to make a difference? And through that, to work with others and to help do the work of helping transform the organizations that we're in, creating the kinds of organizations that we envision, and stewarding, if you will, or playing some role in helping steward the broader culture within which all of this rests. Because one of the things that the kind of mindfulness practices that I offer helps us see is that we're always already embedded in a world that we didn't create. And yet how we engage with one another, with ourselves, with all that arises in this world matters. And if we can access more of the resources and power that we have, we can be always engaged in the process of transforming these systems and structures that have created patterns of inclusion and exclusion that we are up against in the world, wherever we happen to find ourselves. So, for me, I enter into this conversation as a law professor for the last 22 years or so here in San Francisco. A law professor in this particular body. For those of us who are able to see visually and have your camera on, you can see that I'm a brown bodied Black American woman, cisgender female. And I name those characteristics of the embodiment that I inhabit in the world, and through which I encounter other people. Because part of what our mindfulness practices can do is bring us into more refined, more subtle relationship with how it is that our particular embodiments meet others, and how it is that uh, deep kind of trainings, orientations, what we call bias, that we have inherited and that have been inculcated in us, given that we live in that world that I mentioned before. Mindfulness can help us become more subtly aware of the different ways that we might be perceiving other people through the lenses of these subtle biases, the way we might be forecasting, right? Certain ways that, other people, other embodied folks, we may be perceiving or presuming we know what they think, we know something about their background. All of these very subtle ways that human beings kind of navigate a social landscape, the social psychologists tell us, are often not readily subject to change, even when we intend not to be acting from these places. And so we know something about this in this era. We've all been trained in, many of us have been trained in implicit bias. We know, or in the awareness of implicit bias and its prevalence. In addition, many of us have been trained in recognizing the consequences of some of those biases, including, the occurrence of things called microaggressions. But even today, we're seeing not just implicit bias and microaggressions and sort of the unconscious coming to consciousness around these themes, but we're also living in a time where we have kind of revivified the idea of consciously embracing our biases. And so we are seeing, again, a rise of more explicit forms of othering, whether it be racism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, fear of all kinds of, the so-called foreigner. In other words, these interpersonal dynamics that arise when we come together across lines of real and perceived difference are present within us, in our institutions, in our workplaces. And they may be more or less on the surface. And part of what my work has been about then has been about bringing the beautiful modalities that we call mindfulness, compassion practices, the practices that neuroscientists, this great generation, I think, of practitioners and scientists and teachers have kind of delivered to the world for us to kind of access and bring into our organizational spaces. That contemplative science field, bringing that to bear with the field of anti-oppression, social justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work. Bringing those two together has been my kind of sort of a call that's enlivened my work for the past 15 plus years. And that's, that led to the book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice. But again, those who read my book have said to me often, this book is really about not just the inner work of racial justice. It is an introduction to a kind of mindfulness that is robust enough to create in us the kind of resilience that we need to help create resilient interpersonal relationships, right? The kinds of relationships that can withstand meeting across these lines of real and perceived difference, the, again, predictable disagreements, conflicts of perspective, cognitive and emotional dissonance that can arise, that come predictably into the fore because of the fact that we've lived very different lives in very different bodies in a world in which our embodiments do prefigure opportunities and experiences in ways that are not always obvious, especially the experiences of others. So, mindfulness as a support for interpersonal communication, listening. I saw a comment, right? Listening more effectively to one another. Yes, the listening is key when we feel pressured to bring programs and resolve conflict. Without the ability to listen well to one another, we're going to find ourselves missing profound, again, opportunities presented. I do think that these conflicts do present opportunities for us to deepen our ability to thrive together, to minimize the ongoing cycles of wounding and reactivity, and more wounding and reactivity that can arise in these in our workplaces, in our communities, as again a predictable consequence of the world we've inherited, the neighborhoods in which we lived, which were constructed, right, through lenses of bias, lenses of who belongs and who doesn't, right? The legacy of segregation that many of us know from our own lived experience something about is walking into our institutions, right? So what we have lived, where we have lived, what we have seen, what we haven't seen, the communities we've been comfortable with and in, and those that we don't feel comfortable with and in, those things are not just simply left at the door when we enter into our workplaces. Even if those workplaces are really, very much committed to a set of values around inclusion and diversity and so forth, right? So deepening the ability to both listen and to speak from a place of greater intentionality, a commitment to non-harm, but also a certain kind of humility. Can I say that again? A certain kind of humble willingness to learn from each other, to openness to being corrected, willingness to be a little bit vulnerable. We know that in our time and place, we've witnessed a kind of almost celebrity culture around the power of vulnerability. Brene Brown and others have helped us understand that vulnerability need not be a bad thing. At least we've had a discourse emerging around that and a kind of cultural conversation around that. Mindfulness, though, invites this inquiry. What's it like in our own bodies when we are confronted with vulnerability, with the invitation to reveal or to look at how we carry trainings around bias, places that we grew up in, and the different messages we received. How does it feel when we're asked to participate in a conversation and share a bit more of the assumptions and presumptions that we bring? Vulnerability, while we could talk about it as a superpower, actually is something that many of us not very comfortable with, not very comfortable experiencing. And I think we need to really acknowledge the difficulty that we as soft-bellied, carbon-based human beings in a world in which we are being reminded that everything is interconnected, but we are all vulnerable existentially, right? We are meeting in the midst of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, interlocking with the ongoing climate crisis endemic, and now, as we all know, in a time of renewed war with the threat of it expanding in ways that horrify us to imagine. So I'm saying all this just to say, as human beings, we might do well to reflect on what happens in conditions of heightened vulnerability, a heightened sense that we're not safe, and how it is that deep trainings about othering and belonging can be manipulated And we see that going on around us in this sort of, again, revivification of the appeal of racial nationalism, and policies of exclusion, a wall at the border, a don't say gay law in this state or that. Let's not talk about critical race theory or the history that I mentioned. In other words, we are seeing, I think, some of the ways that an unskillful reactivity to vulnerability can show up in all of us and can lead to really, kind of painful, unskillful consequences. How do we access our highest and best to meet these challenges? I think this particular conversation is so important, because what we're looking at when we look at these practices for the inner work, and again, for me, the practices are founded in mindfulness, but are not limited to mindfulness. And when I say mindfulness, I think it's a question of like, what does that mean? Because mindfulness means so many different things to so many different people right now. But pointing at a set of practices that we might engage in, set aside time for, intentionally commit to, that can support us in cultivating greater skillfulness that we can then rely on as a trait, as a quality that we bring into our interactions with each other. So just to say a bit more about the kinds of practices, I think, again, this is a community which is, I think, well versed in the practices that I'm speaking about. As it was mentioned, I was trained in mindfulness-based stress reduction, the teacher training program for that, cultivated by the University of Massachusetts, now often promulgated through Brown Center for Mindfulness. So this mindfulness-based stress reduction program, of course, is a secular program very focused on the human ability to cultivate within ourselves a kind of a deeper skillfulness in recognizing what's happening with us when we meet the challenges of our time. So recognizing what's happening us on a kind of a neurobiological, emotional, and sensory level when we pick up an email that we consider to have something that's threatening to us, or when we see an interaction or meet someone that triggers a reminder of a prior engagement that caused us some wounding. In other words, the neurobiology of difference and othering is a profoundly kind of interesting field of inquiry in cognitive science. And the intersection between what we know about how the body reacts to threat, the threat sensors, how we put up walls, how we kind of pull back from conversations, fall silent, avoid each other. We know something about that. And the question is, how can we not just know it cognitively? How can we know what's happening in our own bodies as a sign of the work that we individually might do, the way we might cultivate our own power in transforming what could be sensed as threat into opportunity? Mindfulness, I think, has a profound ability to help us with this. But I will also say that not every mindfulness is the kind of mindfulness that I think is really robust enough for this. So I want to name that I feel very privileged to be a part of a broad network of scientists, researchers who have been really exploring mindfulness as a support for our engagement in the world. Mind and Life is an organization of which I'm a fellow. They are researching mindfulness and have been supporting the research community in mindfulness for many, many years. And one of the leaders in that organization, Richard Davidson, is someone at the University of Wisconsin who has created a Center for Healthy Minds. And I'm naming them because their organization is one of the organizations that I think we want to pay more attention to, insofar as they've helped identify mindfulness as a part of a complex of orientations that together might help us expand our ability to flourish personally, interpersonally, and systemically, and to create organizations where we may be more mindful, be more flourishing, um, have a more positive impact in the world. So I want to name the 4 pillars of flourishing that the Center for Healthy Mind has put out into the world. The first is awareness, and that's where mindfulness can come in, right? And we can talk more about that. But again, I think this community is familiar with mindfulness as a support for becoming more aware individually within ourselves, the thoughts, emotions, sensations that are coming up for us in difficult moments of interaction, but also deepening our ability to be externally mindful or socially mindful, to notice what's happening in the rooms when a comment is made that might be threatening to some in the room, when someone has entered into our community whose background or identity suggests we might need to extend ourselves in ways to create more supportive connectivity, and to make sure they feel more included than not. So mindfulness can support us in that kind of awareness, which is a pillar of flourishing identified by the Center for Healthy Minds. The second pillar is connection. And that's where we look at how do we make manifest our appreciation for each other, our compassion for each other. And those kinds of interpersonal dynamics of manifesting what is well and expanding social well-being, positive social interaction, are really important to our being able to, again, take the benefits of our awareness and deliver them more purposefully in our workplaces. The third pillar, insight. And actually, insight I happen to love, right? Some of you know that I've used the phrase color insight to describe how it is that mindfulness can support us in moving away from color blindness and into an openness to understand more effectively about how our social identities, not only racial identities, but the intersections between race and gender and our particular class background, where we've lived regionally, to be more curious rather than fearful about exploring some of the ways that we have imbibed trainings about what it means to be in this kind of body versus that, and to be more intentionally courageous about learning from each other and working together collaboratively to maximize the potential of our difference. I use the phrase color insight in my book and elsewhere to describe how we can more insightfully understand, be open to learning as a kind of a beautiful gift, so not be fearful about knowing or learning or being made aware of the ways that we haven't been educated about certain things and wanting to learn more. To me, this is a beautiful opportunity, maybe unique on the world stage because of the particular kinds of diversities we have in the United States, because of the particular support we have for learning about each other and integrating that into a kind of multicultural democratic experiment that requires that we be able to listen to each other and learn from each other and change our perspective in response when we discern that it might be the right thing to do, right? The moral, ethical underpinnings of mindfulness, in other words, that commitment to not doing harm and to learning how better to not do harm together, are something that we want to draw more into the conversation about how we create organizational and more collective forms of mindfulness. There's a kind of a moral or ethical call that ties to the deep foundation of mindfulness and the orientation toward not harming, minimizing the ways that we do harm, first to ourselves, but certainly to each other. And so becoming more insightful, having more understanding of harm that has been done and ways that we can together create more spaciousness around reckoning with those harms, but also minimizing the unconscious kind of reification and replication of harmful patterns. But that also means deepening our ability to forgive, or at least to be open to change and to belief that what has happened in the past does not necessarily have to determine what happens in the future. That the different ways that people like me have been received in the past does not necessarily limit or predict how a person like me might be received in the future. So deepening that capacity for being able to inhabit each moment with a fresh perspective. And knowing that that's not an easy thing to do. So we might have to constantly be noting with compassion for ourselves the ways we're not ready, right? To forgive or to forget or to feel trust, a sense of ability to trust. We have to cultivate the ability to trust, and we must cultivate organizations and relationships that are trustworthy. We cannot presume that just because we put mindfulness or flourishing or thriving or any other kind of term on top of a program or a practice, that is one that anyone of any background can feel safe in, right? So building spaces that are safer, braver, more trustworthy is an important. Again, I consider this to be a part of the ethical dimension of what we're talking about. Recognizing that just because we intend to do no harm, again, I noticed this was mentioned in the chat, there is a gap often between intent and impact. And minding that gap, as they say in the UK, mind the gap, right? There are posters all over. If you've ever been to Britain or England, as I have, if you're in the public transport, right? Our equivalent of BART in California, the tube, right? You'll see these signs about the gaps where your foot can slip into if you're not careful. Mind the gap. Mind that gap between intent and impact. Mindfully noticing if a comment that we made that we didn't intend harm actually did do harm. And not jumping into our defensive posture, which we all know how to do, but seeing this as a moment where we may learn, grow, and inviting a kind of space within which to grow on all sides of these kinds of conflicts. So, yes, there's so much more, again, that I could say, but I want to begin. I want to sort of glide path us toward closing this part of the presentation and opening up to more Q&A by identifying that fourth pillar, right? So mindfulness or awareness, connection, insight, and then the fourth pillar of flourishing, purpose, or a sense of intentional motivation aligned with our values, right? That I think in some sense we might have started there. Because how we intend to employ mindfulness, for example, or to create more inclusive ways of engaging in the inner work, for example, is really important. And intending to bring mindfulness to bear on minimizing, for example, racial bias, narrowing the focus just a little bit here to that particular point here. We need to cultivate an intentionality around that because, again, it's not something that necessarily automatically or automagically, as they say, arises. So how willing are we to bring our inner work practices right to bear on these difficult challenges around inclusion, exclusion, othering, and belonging? To excavate some of the ways that we have been trained in othering, or at least being a little bit cool or a little bit restrained or fearful, or whatever it is that if we are, really willing to admit it to ourselves, we are struggling with. So I want to just close then, I guess, by just saying that that for me, what all of this means is what I want to kind of try and amplify more and more in the work, and have been in the work that I've done. My book certainly amplifies this in different ways, is that to really bring the power of mindfulness to bear in interpersonal and social settings, given the context of division and polarization that we're in right now and have been in this country and elsewhere, it kind of ebbs and flows, but it has never really been a place where we haven't felt some of these social divisions and conflict. And we're at a point where we're seeing it more perhaps than we did 5 or 10 years ago, but it ebbs and flows. in contexts like this, we need not just mindfulness, but a kind of mindfulness supportive environment or ecology. You might say an ecology of just mindfulness, of inclusive mindfulness, that's founded in a certain kind of ethical commitment. The simplest way to summarize that ethics is we are working to do as little harm as possible. I would say no harm, but we know we're going to do some harm. Self-compassion. To minimize the harm that we do, to take the steps to right the wrongs that do occur as best we can, but also to open to possibility, to not cling, right? Because when something happens that feels harmful, the temptation is to just seize on that. We can both name the work to be done, but also open up at the same time to more possibility. So that mindfulness supportive ethics, that willingness to be open to being well, first and foremost, to recognizing that even though we have work to do in this arena, we are here together. There's wellness that we want to amplify that is manifest by the fact that we are here together and that we have the courage to turn toward what is difficult. So starting perhaps with appreciation for what is well within us as we gather and meditate and focus on these difficult issues, but then intentionally embarking on a set of programs and practices that enhances our interpersonal and collective well-being, a kind of a positive psychological, but also positive mindfulness, again, grounded in our capacity to use our power for good in the world, and recognizing that that's already happening to some degree, or else we wouldn't be here. But also not letting that stop us from doing the work of making things just a little bit better, and then showing up with a fresh perspective the next moment. And having that ethical commitment to being lifelong colleagues in this work, collaborators in this work, is part of what makes me joyful and excited to be turning toward a mindful future with you good people. So I want to close there and invite questions, reflections, thoughts that are coming up in response. I see a question. What are some of the ways that you are seeing organizations bring I can't see the base of the question. Mark, is there something you can share? Some of the ways, let me see if I can scroll it down. Okay, that you're seeing organizations bring the topic of inclusion, belonging, diversity in the workplace. Well, I was actually literally just on a call this morning with a law firm in which more and more people are seeing the intersections. They are taking me up on this challenge of seeing the intersections between diversity, equity, inclusion, and well-being practices, mindfulness practices. We are, I think, just at the kind of early stages of more skillfully integrating these domains of practice. But law firms are doing it. How does it look? It looks like, again, stitching together those two worlds. We've got DEI work happening over here. We've got well-being work starting to happen over there. How do they intersect? And what is the kind of agenda of work and practice and education that arises out of deepening the intersection between inner work on the one hand and this outer work of making our systems and structures more capable of delivering us to the lived sense of justice and the lived sense of inclusion. How we feel in our interactions together, what policies and practices and structures support us in feeling the strength of our gifts and our inherent belonging. So, that looks like and can look more like organizations taking, for example, some of the acronyms that we use in mindfulness. One of the acronyms that I use a lot is the STOP practice, STOP. And what I want to suggest is we might at every turn be asking ourselves, how might some practice that we develop for ourselves be expanded through the lens of an interpersonal or collective practice? So take the STOP practice as an example. Again, mindful.org has published a summary of this practice with a little bit of a guided meditation, and you can find that very easily that I wrote for mindful.org. You can find it doing a search. We might put a link to it. But it's taking the STOP of the word stop and using it as an acronym. The S is just we stop, we pause. This is a personal practice that we can do in the moment where we feel like, oh, we need to respond to something that happened. It's a microaggression. It's something, an incident where I feel like somebody's disrespected another person or group. I want to react. I might react in a way that I want to make sure I'm reacting as skillfully as I can, given the range of options that I have. So the stop practice is a way of just pausing, stopping, taking a conscious breath, perhaps feeling the ground beneath us and feeling the resources within us to discern wise action. So ST, taking that conscious breath, and then O, observing the thoughts, emotions, sensations, and what else is here for me to see as I discern what actions, what power I can exert here to proceed with presence in the face of this challenge. That's the P. So S, stop. T, take a conscious breath, observe what is here, what is there for me to learn, how does it intersect with my values, and then to proceed with a sense of our power, a sense of presence, purpose, into an engagement that might make the most of our opportunities to positively influence what happens next. So that STOP acronym is a personal kind of portable way of thinking about how we move off the cushion, right? Take what we've gathered in the moments where we pause, we become familiar with our own reactivity, we deepen our ability to feel well within ourselves, to feel content within ourselves. These are some of the ways that I think about what our mindfulness practice is. Our personal committed 10 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, 30 to 45 minutes a day, whatever your personal commitment to practice is. Those formal commitments support us in them being able to access the stop practice on the go, on the fly. When we like, oh, I got to return this email, I got to return this text. Let me pause and consider what's happening and proceed from there. Well, the STOP acronym could also be used in an organizational sense. Some incident has happened. Some figure has made a comment that's harmful. Can we stop and pause, create a moment where the organization comes together, takes a conscious breath, pauses, kind of accesses the best within us to help us observe what happened, who's impacted, what are some of the emotional and other kind of ramifications of what's happening internally, externally. And from that place, proceed with some intentionality in response to that incident. So do we see how that acronym could be used as a suggestion for what we can do collectively? It's not only a personal practice. It's a way of saying we as organizations sometimes need to stop, take a breath, and kind of do a quick check-in. What have we done? What are we doing? What did that particular incident send out? How do we repair with the power that we have? Collectively, we're so much more powerful to make a difference. And then also to always have that ongoing, we're always learning ethos, so that we're not like puffed up with like, look how great we handled that. We did that. Let's be open to learning. How was that received? And how do we begin again when necessary to continue the process, right? Recognizing that it's an iterative process, not linear, and not feeling therefore defeated when we have to continue this work, right? Sometimes I'll hear, oh, didn't we do that training last year? And shouldn't we? It's ongoing. It's ongoing. So I see another question here. It's hard to have that discernment with chatter in the head and emotions roiling in the stomach. Yeah. A tool to shut that down is needed, right? To begin that stop practice. I think that's right. So this is why we engage in a commitment to the regular practice of mindfulness, actually. We could try to think of the regular, however length of time that we devote to mindful walking. If sitting meditation isn't working for you at a given time, and I'll tell you, in these last few months, or weeks even. There have been times when I've been feeling the threat of some sort of physical overwhelm. Maybe it's the word of the news coming out of Ukraine and the images coming out of that, or maybe it's some of the ramifications of the recent Supreme Court um, hearings for Black women who are under the spotlight, facing, sort of powerful others, sometimes embodied in white and male forms, right? And seeing some of that dramatized in the Supreme Court testimony, I'll just say, um, you know, impacted me in my own bodies in ways that I have not even fully articulated. But what I'll say is I was feeling a kind of a cloud of this sort of sadness starting to emerge. And frankly, I'm aware that in this time, a lot of us are feeling burnout, are feeling, we're just on the edge of being able to kind of access our highest and best every day. For me, mindfulness practices can help me notice when I'm feeling a little bit more of the sense of whatever the signs are for me of sadness before they might land in something worse like depression or burnout. And so regular practices help, but sometimes just sitting on the cushion is hard to do when you're already feeling sad. You sit, for me, I sit and some tears come, right? I might just sit and cry for the whole meditation. Walking meditations, I can laugh a little bit because I've been working with this. Walking meditations, singing, movement, dance sometimes, right? Getting on the phone with my sister or my friend, my best friend, my partner, finding those people that I know love and support me and creating space to reconnect with them. Again, what do we say flourishing is about? Awareness, connection, literally deepening our connections with those with whom we share things that matter. Understanding that burnout is real. Trauma is real. We're all collectively experiencing trauma right now. We're all collectively experiencing the revivification and like re-triggering of deep embedded traumas in our own lives and our own lineages. So, my dear ones, the work that we're doing is so important and it's not trivial in any way. And yet, there is a lightness that we can bring to, well, right here, right now. The sun coming through this window before me, the greenery of the signs that spring is springing here in the Bay Area of California, where I happen to be sitting as I offer these practices. The fact that we're in this network together. So in other words, mindfulness to me always invites an expanding of that aperture. Yes, we can focus on what is challenging and difficult, and we need to, because it's about having the courage to stand in the fire of challenge. I teach lawyers. I bring mindfulness to lawyers. It's about deepening the capacity to stand in the fire of challenge. But it's also about seeing the beautiful potential in confronting what is difficult as a living expression of the magnificence of life, which each of us is. Each one of us has this incredible power that we can't even fully name. We don't even know. I'm thinking of Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, from our own collective U.S. heritage, intellectual heritage, who talked about, that sort of inborn power that's new in each of our nature that we don't even know what it's capable of. I think mindfulness is meant to remind us that we have that power in these moments of difficulty. And so let me just say that as we think about how we move from, really deploy stop, personally or collectively, starting with what is well within. And I'm going to be on a little bit of a mission to join whoever else is out there with wanting to kind of expand the way we offer mindfulness and practice mindfulness, to start it from the place of what is well within us. What are we already at? Where are we already at ease? Don't miss these beautiful green shoots of renewal and healing that are always present. And if we can start our mindfulness from that, let me settle myself in what is well and good and even joyful about being alive. Whew. From there, yes, I can tackle a challenge with you. Yes, I can work with you to make a more positive difference in this world. Why? Because our lives already do matter, and they're not promised to last forever. In fact, they're promised otherwise. We don't know how long we have, but we know we have right now. How do we want to live in this moment? Is again that kind of centering, bracing wake up call that for me supports us then in like, yes, when a moment gets tough, I can stop, I can take a breath, I can see this difficulty, but also put it in context, see the joy potential here, the connection potential here, and proceed from there. I'm realizing that we are out of time just when I'm getting all excited and joyful and seeing some of your beautiful reflections in the chat.
Indeed. Oh my gosh.
Woo!
Thank you. Thank
This
you.
is
Yeah,
why we're
it's like that. I was like, yeah, Rhonda, go.
Seriously, oppression disconnects us from the joy that is ours to live.
Yeah.
And for me, what does anti-oppression look like? First and foremost, like this. Like we access the joy that is our birthright. And not just the joy within us, but the joy together. Look at these beautiful faces, this beautiful energy. Accessing the joy that comes from being together is our true birthright. But living in circumstances of like challenge and struggle and competition disconnects us from that. And so, yes, let's bring mindfulness. Let's amp up the power of what we call mindfulness to do work on these multiple levels of skillful capacity building, but also just living in the power of our joy as individuals, but also really even more beautifully in some sense as this collective manifestation of the power of life.
Wow. On how many levels can I say yes?
Thank you for those final closing statements. They're very powerful. And I'm pasting your Audible link here again for people to check out. And definitely support Rhonda by checking out her book. And we're at time here. Thank you so much, Rhonda, for participating. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for being here.
Thank you all.
Thank
Look forward to
you very much,
seeing you
Rhonda.
on the road
It's
again.
inspirational. Yeah,
Thank you.
we'll be in touch. Thank you.